Hi everyone, I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about the eukaryotes that we're going to be discussing this week. So the first one that we're going to talk about is the fungi. Now fungi are classified by sexual reproduction. As far as their cell wall, one of the major features that they have, which is different than a lot of the other microbes, is going to be chitin. The fungi also can be microscopic to macroscopic. Okay, you can have simplistic unicellular organisms such as yeast to multicellular molds and mushrooms specifically. There's a concept in the text that they talk about with regards to being dimorphic. What that means is that based on temperature, they can go from a yeast to a mold, or they can go from a mold to a yeast. Molds are differentiated by whether they have hyphae, spores, and mycelium. So a hyphae originates from the spore, and it's the sexual part of the molds. You'll see that they're long and wispy, if you will. The spores, you can see pictures in your book, they're usually round. They'll land on the surface and then germinate from that point. The mycelia is a collection of hyphae with some spores in it. Fungi tend to be heterotrophic. They can be decomposers, saprobes. Any fungal infection is referred to as mycoses, and they generally can be found everywhere. I mean, obviously, the polar caps and whatnot probably wouldn't be an ideal spot, but you can find them. The next group we want to talk about are going to be the algae. So algae and protozoa combined, they are known as protists. Algae are classified according to color. Their cell wall can have different things such as cellulose, pectin, silicon dioxide, calcium carbonates. Similar to the fungi, they could be microscopic to macroscopic, unicellular to multicellular. As far as some of those microscopic multicellular things like seaweed, or where we're going to talk about is going to be the microscopic dinoflagellates in a moment. They are photosynthesizers. They photosynthesize a lot in natural water sources. They're part of the food chain as well. So where do algae become an issue for us as humans? They become an issue with regards to the dinoflagellates. So you have a shellfish, pretend that this is a clam. This is the meat within the clam. So as the water comes through, what happens is all those dinoflagellates set themselves into the meat. They're taken into the meat. And then what happens is that you could go to a raw bar and eat that meat and end up with a neurotoxin. So they produce very, very potent neurotoxins that could potentially kill you. One form of dinoflagellates that you might have heard about before are red tides. So we can see those in the ocean. They actually have a reddish hue to them. Next group are the protozoa. So protozoa are unicellular, usually near water, some sort of water source. They like moisture. So even if they're not in water themselves, as long as they're near moisture, they're fine. They are part of the food chain. They are heterotrophic as well, and they like to feed. So this is one of the first that we're going to talk about as far as algae that's going out and actually trying to feed, which could be a real issue, especially if you're talking about some of the amoeboid movements and what have you. So they break down into a trophozoite or a cyst. A trophozoite is the active feeding stage. The cyst is sort of the dormant inactive stage. Most of the time you will ingest a cyst into your body, where it will then activate itself to a trophozoite. Now, protozoa are classified according to movement. So they break the movement down according to mastigophora, which is flagellated movement or flagella, sarcodina, which is amoeboid movement, ciliophora, which is your ciliates, and apicomplexa, which is a complex life cycle, and it may or may not have had some of these other movements throughout them. The last group are the helminths. So helminths are parasitic worms. And remember, anything with the name parasite means that it's going to harm the host. They have a mouthpiece that they use for attachment. That mouthpiece can have hooks, suckers, or a combination of both. They have sexual organs. They could be male, female, or both, a hermaphrodite. They have primitive systems, like a primitive digestive system, primitive nervous system, etc. So we break them down. Now I know that the textbook goes over and it breaks it down by roundworms and flatworms. I'd like to take it a step differently and break it down: roundworms, which are your nematodes, tapeworms, which are your cestodes, and the flukes, which are the trematodes. So these technically are your two flatworms, but I think it's easier when you're starting out learning about the helminths to break it down into the three groups so that you can visualize those three different groups. As far as the development of helminths, they start off as eggs. They will go as larvae, usually into an intermediate host, and then into adults. Now, sometimes they'll find a human and end up doing these different stages in there. So the textbook talks about intermediate hosts versus definitive hosts. So an intermediate host is a host that's part of the life cycle, and then there's definitive hosts, and that's where it's going to complete its maturing, and usually the sexual aspects will take place there.